Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum, and we are headed down the early jet road as we continue to look at some of the very first generation fighters to come into the Navy or the Air Force. And today, I have a very interesting airplane. I use that word a lot. And I'm with my erudite assistant today, Greg Kenny. He gave me a word. This one actually, Greg, is short enough that I'm not like suffering oxygen loss by the time I get to the end of the word. But we're in front of the, this is actually an F model. This is a Thunderstreak, but we're going to cover the F-84 all the way across all of its versions. But first, as you can tell, Greg has picked up an interesting hat for me today. Now, you know, we filmed these during the week, so Greg came in and said, it is Taco Tuesday, so hence I am in the food hat. So I'm going to lose this thing. I got it off there. We'll get the hair down. And off camera, another perfect catch by Mr. Kenny. So this particular aircraft, this is the headlong race that we were dealing with out of World War II with jet fighters. Remember the Russians? We've talked about what the Russians were doing in the Cold War. The United States, the British were running as fast as they possibly could to field these next generations of jets as we moved out of piston engine fighters. And one of those companies that was charged with that was Republic. In 1944, they were charged with coming up with another jet fighter, and they came up with the Thunderjet. Now, the Thunderjet was a straight-wing jet fighter, had a J-35 engine, subsonic, first flew in 1946. Lockheed, as we have discussed, did the P-80, and then in the F-80, this was eventually the F-84 in various variants. Now, think of it this way. We're all learning new technology, and there's a big challenge there when you learn new technology, and we've talked about some of these other Century Series fighters. Things just sometimes don't work out the way that you've planned. That was the problem with the F-84. Early, it was Republic. Now, interestingly enough, Greg, if you look at the genesis of this airplane, they actually Republic started with the P-47, and they were thinking about a redesign on the P-47 and throw a jet in that. That was a huge piston engine fighter. Didn't really make any sense at the end of the day. So they took out a clean sheet of paper at Republic, and they decided they were going to go with a new fighter. This was in 1944. In 1946, we got the first flight out of the airplane. Teething problems were immense with the straight-wing F-84. Everything from, and I'm going to reach over here. Now, this is the F version, the swept-wing version. Greg can throw up a straight-wing version of this airplane. We're going to talk about generationally, but the various generations. But the problems they had were anything, and we've talked about the Century Series fighters with inertial coupling, high-speed stalls, stress on both the wings and the horizontal and vertical stabilizer. Well, guess what, Greg? The F-84 had all of that. It was a very fun fighter. You could kill yourself in so many different ways with the airplane because they had so many design problems. From high-speed stall pitch up to if the aircraft eventually ended up having a Mach rating, it had a speed limit put on it, which I think was about 0.82 Mach in the early versions. And the reason for that was you could tear the wings off the airplane, or you would get stress fractures and rippling on the horizontal stabilizer on the early versions of this airplane. So they had all kinds of trouble with this early jet. Now, the interesting thing was the airplane really came into its own in 1951 with the G model, which was the definitive straight-wing version of the airplane. Overall, there were about 7,500 of the type made, but it was that G model that went into battle in Korea. Now, they figured out fairly quickly that it was not a match for the MiG. could not be handled with the MiG. And so what they ended up doing was they converted it to a ground attack airplane. Now, Greg, the numbers on this airplane are staggering in Korea as far as ground attack. In Korea, the Thunderjet accounted for 60% of all targets destroyed. Which gives you an idea of how many sorties this airplane was flying and how much time it spent in battle. It did not do well as an air superiority fighter. And again, for all the reasons I just talked about, it had a lot of really quirky tendencies in the air, and it just was not good in air-to-air combat maneuvering. But it did excel very much so in the ground attack role. Now, this is also, Greg, I would call it the Frankenstein monster of jet fighters early in the war. And Greg says, Fred, why is that, Fred? Well, quite simply, and we're going to go through some of this, Republic took the F-84 and they did all kinds of experiments on the airplane. One experiment was to mate it up with a B-36 on a trapeze or on a wing attachment setup. The idea was that the B-36, to give you an idea how big that airplane was, could carry one in the belly or it could actually carry two on the wings. So the idea was that the airplane, remember with the B-17, fight its way all the way into the target and fight its way all the way out. Well, think about this. You have a bomber that can carry its fighter escort into the target, release its fighter escort, do what it needs to do, and come back out. The reality of the situation was that did not work extremely well. Now, this concept goes all the way back to, there were parasite airplanes, and Greg can throw some of this. There were parasite aircraft, and the concept goes all the way back to the Zeppelins, where some of the Zeppelins were carrying biplane fighters. We have the Goblin. Greg can throw that up, the little Goblin, the cute little Goblin fighter that they talked about flying in. And also the Germans used it with the Mistel quite a bit, which was a Focke-Wulf 190 and a Ju-88. Now the Mistel aircraft that the Germans flew had a shaped charge in the nose, and it was primarily used for bridges, and the FW-190 pilot would separate and fly the Ju-88. At that point just became a flying bomb, a missile into the target. The Americans took that a step further with the jets and thought that they could maybe convert these B-36s into fighter carriers and go into the target. Didn't work. The other thing that they did, now this is, Greg, actually kind of terrifying if you think about it, is they took the Thunderjets and they put a rocket motor on them, and they had them on a vehicle, and they would raise them up and they would launch them towards the enemy. So the idea was you didn't need a runway, and you could line up hundreds of these things. Now this thing, and the reason they did that was this also carried something kind of unique, and that was it carried a Mark 7 nuclear weapon. And the idea behind that is that you could put the nukes on this, and Greg can actually throw up some video of that. Put the nukes on this, pitch it up, and then launch it towards the target. Greg, there's only one problem with that. What's the problem, Greg? The boom. So you get in there, you drop your nuclear bomb. If you're doing the lab maneuver, you know, where you throw the nuclear bomb at the target, but there's no place to go. You're in a fighter that doesn't have a lot of fuel, and you're trying to get the heck out of Dodge, and you're going to be dealing with two things when that bomb detonates. You're going to be dealing with an electromagnetic pulse, which is probably going to destroy every electrical instrument or knock out every electrical instrument in the aircraft. And the other, well, really two other things, the buffeting from the blast and the radiation. What does that make, Greg, my erudite assistant? That makes for a very bad day. You are probably going to be glowing in the dark after that. But they did successfully, they tried this with the Thunderjet, where they launched unmanned versions of the airplane, and it worked. They launched fully loaded versions, and then they actually put a guy in it, and fired him off, and the airplane actually got up to speed, and which is just absolutely amazing to me. But it worked. It didn't really turn out to be very practical, but they experimented with that down the line with F-100s and other airplanes. But the Thunderjet was kind of the first version of this. Now, the Air Force looked at this airplane, and again, we're talking in the 50s, there were all kinds of versions of different fighters as we kept updating, just spending a lot of money and continuing to update, and technology was changing all the time. So they went, well, guess what? We want this Thunderjet to be comparable to the Sabre, the F-86. So they were going to do the plan view. They swept the wings. And the idea was at that time that this, the F-84, the F model, would be about a 55% crossover in tooling. When you're manufacturing airplanes, everything is done on jigs, or the parts are stamped out and they're made. And when we're talking about tooling, we're talking about the equipment needed to manufacture the jet. They thought that they were going to get 55% of the tooling as a crossover. Guess what, Greg? That didn't happen. They ended up with 15%. So this ended up being a completely new design. But they put a J65 engine in it, which continued to have problems, and the aircraft arguably was underpowered. It was subsonic, and the performance that they got from the Thunderjet to the Thunderstreak was not that good. So then what did they do, Greg? What did they do? What do you do when you do something like that? Well, what you do is you take a turbojet engine with about 5,000 horsepower, which has a spinning prop on the front of it, and you put that on the airplane because, heck, we've launched it with a rocket, we've hooked it up to a bomber. Why not take it out and throw a gigantic engine on it? That was kind of like taking your family Yugo and dropping a 12-cylinder Merlin in it, and let's see how it goes out and happens with that. What do you think happens when you do that, Greg? Not really good stuff. That became the Thunder Screech, which the aircraft was so loud at Edwards Air Force Base that when they were flying it, they couldn't operate it. They had to go up into Nevada because people were complaining. Now, remember where Edwards Air Force Base was in the 50s. It was pretty far out there. It was making so much noise that people were complaining about the airplane. The other thing was, it made the ground crews, it was so loud, it made the ground crews nauseous. The sound from the airplane made the ground crews sick. And on top of that, the Republic test pilot that flew the airplane for the first time barely got the airplane back and said, you're not big enough and there's not enough of you, this is a quote, for you to ever get me to fly that airplane again. So it scared the heck out of him. So he decided not to fly it again. Another gentleman who flew the airplane 11 times had 10 forced landings out of the 11. So putting a gigantic propeller with a turboprop on this didn't work much either. Now, the one thing, Greg, that is kind of interesting, and this is disputed, the Guinness Book of World Records, what am I getting my W's there? World Records. The Guinness Book of World Records shows that that particular variant of this airplane was the fastest propeller-driven airplane ever made. The reality of that is that's probably not true. That's probably held by some of those highly modified P-51s and Rare Bear, actually, and the Bearcat that we did. So there were some airplanes modified, but Guinness actually shows that this airplane in that turboprop version was the fastest. I don't think so. Ultimately, they ended up shelving I would call the whole Frankenjet line. They didn't do anything with it. And we went back to this F model, and we decided that we were going to put nukes on it, and we were going to have that Mark 7 nuclear bomb. We were going to have it fly for SAC, the Strategic Air Command, SAC. The airplane flew with SAC for quite some time. Again, was a runway hog. In other words, with those nuclear bombs and fully loaded, it did not, it performed, but it did not perform well. The fleet had a lot of corrosion issues, and there were a lot of hours to come back with these F-84Fs and get them back to being airworthy because of corrosion. Ultimately, corrosion in the fleet grounded them, retired them in 1971 as they retired with Air National Guard units. Now, the airplane didn't end there, Greg. The airplane went on with the Royal Hellenic Air Force until 1991. The airplane flew on. This particular aircraft doesn't really have much of a remarkable history. It is in strategic. You see that nice nuclear bomb on the side of the airplane. This is a SAC aircraft. The frame rail, Lieutenant Al Dempsey, he's actually a docent, and we're gonna do a under the cowling with him and another pilot, probably on the F-100, but we're gonna cover this. The other thing, when you come to the museum, there's a signature on this airplane that you're gonna wanna see, and that is, and we have a lot of airplanes that are signed. This one is signed by Lockheed test pilot Robert Gilliland. Actually cut his teeth in this airplane when he first started flying. So what I want to do now, Greg, I'm going to put my little airplane down here. That could be a song. Put my airplane down. No? Maybe a Western song? My airplane got drunk and left me in a bar somewhere? I don't know, Greg. What do you think? But with that, we're going to go with, because you probably were seeing Big Red if you flew this airplane past the Mach number that you were supposed to. Now this is, Greg's picked something out interesting for me. This is deliciously Big Red. It is with real sugar. Greg, you're just feeding my sugar habit here. This has 160 calories per bottle. The sell-by date on this, again, I don't know what's in this stuff. This is October 8th, 22, which is interesting. It's got some carbs in it, but you know, it looks not too noxious. This looks not too dangerous. What we've done now is we have poison control on speed dial, which you can't see. Greg has his cell phone up in case I drink it and fall over. But what I want to do today is, it took a lot of guts to go to war in these types of aircraft, and so the guys that flew this airplane in Korea and then flew them as nuclear bombers, I want to salute you. That was a tough job. It was a thankless job. The nuclear bomber pilots couldn't tell their families. They couldn't say anything about it. They just went to work and came home. Their families never knew that they were out there. But to all you Thunderjet and Thunderstreak pilots, I salute you. Oh, Greg, home run. I like this one. This is pretty good. I'm going to keep this one with me today, Greg. So, this is quite nice. Quite nice. Now, this airplane, I said, it's in SAC colors. Rather unremarkable. This aircraft is a survivor of from Chanute Air Force Base when the museum shut down. Interestingly enough, Greg, this was in Thunderbird colors. This airplane actually flew, this type of airplane flew for the Thunderbirds. And so we felt, as with all of the aircraft with our collection, that what we would do is actually bring the airplane back into an operational livery. And that's what this is today. This is actually in a SAC livery. Greg, you know, one of the interesting things about these early war fighters, and I talked about all of the tendency issues with this airplane, which there are just a bazillion of them. Bazillion is actually a term, by the way. Did you know that, Greg? It is. One of the things about this airplane that is actually, this particular version of the airplane is the F model, is that if you got into a flat spin, and by the way, this is a Fred fun fact, the Fred fun fact for the day, so pay attention here. This airplane was unrecoverable in a flat spin below 10,000 feet. Think about that for a minute. You have an operational jet fighter in the United States Air Force that if you got into a flat spin below 10,000 feet, basically open the door and get out. That was it. So that is just an amazing, and one of the interesting things about the design trade-offs that they made at the time, was that the airplane had that kind of a safety challenge. And you can understand when you go back and look at the losses in training and in operational losses in this non-combat, these early jets, there were a lot of them, and that was the reason, because they all had these interesting tendencies. So the Fred fun fact for the day is do not get in a flat spin in an F-84F below 10,000 feet. Now, interestingly enough, Greg, if you want to be your own Thunderjet pilot, I'm going to have another swig of this thing. You know what? I don't know if it turned my mouth blue like that one drink did, but my mouth could be all bright red from this thing. I don't know if you can get that on camera, but this stuff is, when I was a kid, I used to love to drink this stuff, and this is about as red as it gets. Now, Greg does this. He runs around the office, he wears this cap, and he makes jet noises. So if you wanted to be your own Thunderjet pilot, you can go out to the website, pick up one of these hats, and you will be an honorary Thunderjet pilot. If you're lucky enough, you might even be able to get a Mark 7 nuclear warhead and terrify your neighbors and friends. Actually, please don't do that. We would rather you not run around your neighborhood with a nuclear weapon. But go out to the website and pick this up. It is finely crafted with a vintage Korean War roundel on the front of it. So I'm going to put that down. That is our gratuitous product display. But when you come to the museum, I want you to check this airplane out. This is an example of that continuous tech tree that we had rising out of the Korean War with all the American fighters. And on top of it, you can come out and meet Lieutenant Al Dempsey. He is one of our docents. He's a really nice guy. You may want to ask if maybe he has a nuclear weapon laying around somewhere. You never know. But come out and check out this airplane. It is a true survivor and a very, very unique aircraft. Go out to our YouTube channel and smash that subscribe button. Like us on Facebook. Remember, we cannot bring these airplanes back into their original form without your donations. Go out to our website and give us a donation if you can. My name is Fred Bell. I'm the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. Thank you very much. Have a great day.